So there's two major scenarios that we're looking at here. One is that they return from July 4th recess, and we see a replay of what we saw with healthcare so-called reform, this massive tax cut disguised as healthcare reform, in the House. Sarah Cliff has a good timeline of this from Vox. It was on March 24th that Paul Ryan announced in front of reporters at a press conference back when we used to do these things in public that Obamacare is the law of the land. We're going to be living with Obamacare for the foreseeable future. That's when we all celebrated. It was dead, the repeal and replace. On May 4th, 6 weeks later, 45 days later, the House had passed the so-called American Health Care Act. This is the, you'll recall there was a celebration where Donald Trump was in the Rose Garden with a bunch of white guys behind him. And they were all celebrating and high-fiving each other for a bill that, and we'll get to this, that Donald Trump clearly has no idea what it is. Just to the point where his own allies can't help but mention it. So Sarah Cliff came up with 3 lessons that she learned from the fact that that came back. And they sort of mirror what my perspective is, which is, first, that Republican legislators are really motivated to deliver on the big picture goal of Obamacare repeal, even if it doesn't tackle the issues they purport to have with the health care law. In other words, and we talked about this, the attacks on the Affordable Care Act, even from the Republicans, came from the left. Premiums are too high. Healthcare is not generous enough, particularly Donald Trump's. Nothing in the American Health Care Act, or whatever they're calling it in the Senate, addresses the expense of premiums or the scope of coverage for people. Premiums are, in fact, in some instances, less for people, but not if they purchase the same amount of health insurance. The only thing is, it just allows you to buy something that is nominally health insurance, but actually provides you no benefits. That, of course, can be delivered cheaper. So none of the things that they were interested in were addressed by the Better Care and Reconciliation Act in the Senate. But their voters still want Obamacare to be repealed because they were promised it for 7 years. There were 50-some-odd votes. In fact, everybody, including Dean Heller on the Republican side, who says this is problematic, voted for a bill as bad as this one, if not worse, in 2015. Remember that. Dean Heller was for this before he was against it. In 2015, the House and the Senate both passed a repeal and replace of Obamacare. It just so happens they knew President Obama would not sign it. So they were for this before they were against it. The second point is Republican lawmakers are not deterred by a lack of outside validators. In other words, it doesn't matter what the AMA says. It doesn't matter what the hospitals say. None of it matters. In fact, there's no amount of money that they can get from the insurance industry or from any of the players that is going to rival the amount of money they can get from the Koch brothers and their network. And they certainly don't care. You'll recall in the House, they passed a bill that had 17% approval rating. Third, she writes, coming around to this point of view takes time. Took the Republicans in the House a month and a half to wrap their minds around the piece of legislation, make some changes, and decide to pass it. I would say that in that instance, the big thing was, what do we need for cover? In the House, it ended up being we need more generous subsidies. And so they ended up throwing $8 billion at it, and it was just a story that they could cite. And they all voted for it. In this instance, it's going to be opioids. It's going to be rural hospitals in Maine. I mean, we can go down the line. There'll be opioids in West Virginia and Ohio. Maybe some rural hospitals in those places too. Rural hospitals in Maine. You'll end up seeing an expansion of health savings accounts. And perhaps, maybe, I don't know, kicking babies will bring Ted Cruz along. Something particularly cruel that he can go back and praise. So that's going to be scenario one. They're going to come back. They're going to try and pass it that way. It may be at the end of July, it may be mid-July. They've got to do it relatively quickly because the problem they have is that this Better Care and Reconciliation Act is really, essentially, you got to think of it as the 2017 budget resolution. And the problem is they have the 2018 budget resolution, and because of rules that are too arcane for me, really, frankly, to understand, they are starting to bump up against each other in the calendar. So Mitch McConnell has to deal with this in the month of July. So this is a very important time. If you live in one of those states, you have got to essentially get up in the grill, metaphorically speaking, of your senators and make it clear that the problem is not just not enough opioid treatment. The problem is not just rural hospitals. It is the degradation of the quality of health insurance. It is the loss of health insurance for millions of Americans, just as unacceptable if it's 15 million as it would be if it's 22 million, on and on. There is, however, a Plan C for Republicans. And Ed Kilgore at New York Magazine talks about this. And that is, if you contemplate what the Better Care and Reconciliation Act is, if you take out the subsidies, if you look at the private exchanges, right? We know that the Affordable Care Act has three major components: expansion of Medicaid, a patient protection bill of rights, essentially, and exchanges and subsidies in those exchanges if you're from 133% of poverty to 400% of poverty. The ones that implicate the budget, broadly speaking, are just the expansion of Medicaid. Obviously, the subsidies do too, and you can argue, as they have in this, that relaxing rules on insurance will save the government money in some fashion. I mean, I guess that's the way they're getting around the Byrd rule. But you could roll the cuts to Medicaid into the 2018 budget resolution. Because remember, all they care about at the end of the day is saying we got rid of Obamacare and getting the tax cuts. In fact, the tax cuts are probably even more prominent. So they could drop this hot potato, say we're going to work with Democrats to shore up the exchanges. No longer just have 51 votes, right? You need you just need a majority if the Democrats agree not to filibuster. Maybe you need 60. We're going to shore up the exchanges. We're going to keep the patient protection of rights. We're going to call it Trumpcare. We're going to call it the Better Care Act. So we've repealed Obamacare, more or less. Then, in the Budget Reconciliation, the Budget Resolution Act of 2018, which is a reconciliation bill, you're going to slash Medicaid. Maybe you'll slash Medicare a little bit too. And you'll get the vast majority of the bulk of those savings that will allow you to provide the permanent tax cuts that you want. That's the thing also that we have to worry about on some level, because frankly, Medicaid, from their perspective, is the easiest thing for them to vote to cut because they don't think any of those people vote for them anyways. And there was an interesting tweet thread that I saw. I don't have the guy in front of me, actually, but we'll put a link to it in today's show post. Apparently, part of the ACA involved the equivalent of the motor voter bill, where if you signed up for the exchanges, you were automatically registered to vote. And in 2014, the Obama administration essentially jettisoned that aspect of it via the Health and Human Services because there was anger by Republicans on it.
Am I still really bad? But so they undermined the motor voter law as part of ACA?
It wasn't the motor voter law, but there was a motor voter equivalent if you signed up via the exchanges. That was built into it, and they reversed it.
So they own gold themselves there.
That is, I think, what you would call an own goal. It was funny to watch some people going like, oh, it's Obama's fault. Well, no. I mean, the fact that it was not instituted was Obama's fault. And the fact that those, I don't know, couple of million voters who are getting direct benefits from the government maybe weren't registered to vote. That seems like an own goal.
And Reverend Barber was saying more broadly, like the assaults on voting rights generally are connected to this.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah. Well, I looked at the analysis and overall benefited too many white people. So,
Exactly.
To hell with it.
Reverend Barber.
So the tax cuts and Medicaid cuts can be rolled over into the next bill, the 2018 budget resolution, if they want to. Basically, what it is it more or less looks like a Ryan budget. So that's going to be the next fight, assuming the healthcare one goes down. And I don't know. It's of course, it's all part of a long-term plan by Republicans to basically, this is just think of Paul Ryan as a 17-year-old or a college kid, maybe in high school during the Reagan Revolution, as it were, and just frothing at the mouth about the idea of permanent tax cuts and cutting Medicaid, cutting Medicare. If they could get their hands on Social Security, they would do that as well. So that's going to be the next fight. At this point, Trump giveth and taketh away. Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos